Hello, and welcome to Titanic Legacy, a creative collaboration between the Titanic Book Club and Cove Pod, the Carganilla online variety entertainment podcast. Titanic Legacy podcast explores Titanic's lasting impact through conversations with today's creators, authors, artists, historians, filmmakers, experts, entrepreneurs, and more who continue to produce creative work inspired by the Ship of Dreams. If you are tuning in at home doing chores, driving to work, at the gym, working out on your run or your walk, however you're listening, thank you for giving us your time and welcoming us into your lives for the next half hour or so as we talk about Titanic and her long-lasting creative inspiration and impact here on Titanic Legacy, the podcast. I'm your host, Paul Carganilla, and today I have the honor and pleasure of speaking with author Kelly Skwarcan about her book, Iron and Ice, the full tale of the Titanic. But before we bring her in, let me tell you a bit about Kelly and her book. She told me in prep for this conversation that Iron and Ice has been over a decade in the making. I can't wait to dig into that. She just graduated from Notre Dame with a bachelor's in psychology and a minor's in health, humanities, and society, and painting. She actually, if you look up her book on Amazon, she actually painted the cover of the book, the graphic here, when she was in high school. Super cool. She's also currently taking a gap year before she begins her doctoral studies in organizational psychology. Her goal is to have a career as a performance psychology consultant for offshore aerospace and aviation. Wow. During this year, she's grateful to have time to devote to more Titanic events and lecture presentations. We're going to talk all about it, and I think it's time for that conversation to set sail. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to Titanic Legacy podcast, Kelly Skwarcan.
Hi, Paul. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, so glad that you are here. And I tell everybody, out of all the episodes we've recorded, I've had one person in the same time zone as me. I'm here in Southern California. Where are you joining us from?
South Bend, Indiana, right by Notre Dame.
Very cool. Congratulations on graduation.
Oh, thank you so much. It feels like just yesterday, but also a long time at the same time, very oddly.
Wow. Time begins to fly, I think, when you're in school, like each year feels like it's kind of longer, I think. But once you're out of school, I feel like it kind of snowballs. But I want to dig into this 10-year journey of yours. Let's actually rewind to the very beginning of your Titanic interest. What first sparked Titanic in your thoughts and imagination?
Yeah, so I was in fourth grade, and we were tasked with what they called a passion project. And so at the ripe age of 10, of course, I had no idea what my passion was. I was thinking maybe giraffes or Queen Elizabeth II for this school project. And it was a unique project because they didn't want you to go to school and take regular classes all day like normal. They wanted you to just go in, and for 8 hours a day, you would conduct research on whatever your chosen topic was. So it was completely immersive. And at that time, it felt like a hefty commitment. So I went home and explained the project situation to my dad, and he showed me an old National Geographic VHS tape on Titanic. It was black and white. There was nothing cinematic about it, but somehow it just captivated me. And from that moment on, I just dove into the Titanic world headfirst and have not emerged since.
That's amazing. And it starts with this passion project, and you mentioned that this book, Iron and Ice, the full tale of the Titanic, is 10 years in the making. Tell us about that journey. How did it begin, and describe the decade?
Yeah, so the school project went great, but I was just getting started. And so I quickly became the dullest person at school lunchtime. I thought it was a fantastic idea to have my friends, quote unquote, quiz me on the Titanic, where they would ask me any question under the sun, and I would see if I could answer it to the best of my ability. Can't imagine why they didn't love the game, being sarcastic. So finally, it got to the point where one girl said to me, Kelly, you know so much about Titanic, just write it down, get it all out, and we never have to hear about it again. Very famous last words, because we're still talking about it to this day. But that's precisely what I did. So that summer, we're talking fourth grade, in between the summer before fifth grade, I started writing the very first draft of the book. And every single summer after, it became something that I came back to. And as I learned more and grew as a writer during the year, it just evolved and expanded and got rebuilt over and over again. So that's where the decade really comes in. And now, a decade later, of course, Iron and Ice is much different than its original first drafts, but that foundation of love and curiosity for the topic remains unchanged.
And when you're describing your book to people, they say, what is it about? What's your elevator pitch, or how do you describe it?
Yeah, so Iron and Ice is a narrative nonfiction book. So that means like it reads like some of your favorite novels might, with a linear timeline and fast pacing and dynamic characters that you feel like you can connect to. So it's character driven nonfiction, which I like to think about narrative nonfiction and character driven nonfiction as the best way to present historical topics because they allow or they make it accessible and engaging for the widest array of audiences. To really bring the material within its pages to life. So, most of the time, when people come to Titanic for the very first time, you don't want intimidating jargon or technicalities or to be lost in like the sea of minutia that can sometimes happen, especially with Titanic. That can be intimidating for a reader who maybe isn't interested in Titanic at all. Maybe they have seen the movie, maybe they haven't. So my goal was to create a book for them. It's in the middle of the market. So we have on one side books written for children, and on the other extreme, books written by historians for historians. And both are valuable. We need both, they're so important. But there's not a whole lot of books that target the middle of the market for the intelligent adult who wants the full, detailed story, but maybe doesn't want to feel like they're reading a big textbook while they're doing so. So that's where Iron and Ice comes in and what it's trying to do.
When I was reading it, I was thinking this is like so it, kind of groundbreaking in a way, because the way I think Titanic's in books has kind of evolved. You know, you start with your Don Lynch, very like textbook style type of book that you can go and do your research on. And then it kind of like, as more books are published over the years, you kind of have to find an angle. And like you mentioned, the minutia, each of the artists that are artists and authors that we talk to are coming at it from a different angle. Like this is why you should read my book, because it's not like anything you've read, because I'm focusing on this character, on that person, on the rivets, on you know, this and that. But yours is a perfect book for anyone who has sparked. I love that you say it's for like adults, but kids could read it too. I got two copies because after I purchased one, you sent me a signed one. Thank you very much.
Of course.
But I gave my daughter, she's 10, my other copy, and she's loving it. And but what it is and why I love it is it's for that person who's been sparked by Titanic and has an interest in it, wants to learn more about it, but doesn't necessarily want to get into the minutia. And it's gripping, it grabs you, and it just moves from the very beginning. You did such a great job. I can't believe it's your first book, because it is very well crafted. It moves, it's interesting, and I think it is like a gateway drug almost for anyone who has recently become interested and wants to know more.
Thank you so much. Well, I have to tell you, one of the most gratifying things for me, and this just happened this past week actually at the gym, a guy came up to me. He's going to be 76 next week. And he said, Kelly, I read your book. I had zero interest in Titanic. Like, could not care less. He hasn't seen the movie. He's not a Titanic guy by any means. But he said, I read it, and now I'm doing my own research, and I'm diving in, and I want to know more. And why did they name it the Californian? That's so odd for a British ship. And so now he's a Titaniac. And so that just makes my day. And that's really what the book is attempting to do. And it's gratifying to hear that that's coming across.
It's fantastic, and anyone can find it on Amazon. Is that where you tell most people to pick it up if they're interested?
Yeah, yeah. It's in a couple museums throughout the US, but Amazon is the easiest, quickest way for people.
Very good. And I want to say hello to people who are joining us in the live chat, watching live on YouTube. If you have any questions for Kelly, please go ahead and drop them in there, and we'll ask them if they come in before the end of the broadcast here. Another thing about your book that I think is super cool is the last chapter. That's not something that you're going to find in very many Titanic books on the shelves today. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so actually, that's a bit of it's my favorite chapter to well, it was my favorite chapter to write because the experience of writing it was totally unique. I actually wrote it the day that they found the pieces on the seafloor. The RV, found the pieces and it was finally confirmed that yes, indeed, the Titan had imploded. So it was, as you know, like we all lived through that and saw the media day by day, the whole countdown of the oxygen level. It was an excruciating thing to live through. But on the other side of that, a gratifying thing to look at it in the whole larger framework of the Titanic timeline and integrate it into that. And at a global level, to look at it and say, how is this similar and different to what happened 112 years ago? Well, 111 then, between Titanic and the Titan implosion. So I have to say that was probably the most interesting part of writing the book because I didn't anticipate it. We were very close to releasing the book, and then the news broke of all of this, and it became a media frenzy. And we quickly realized, oh my gosh, we can't release it until we integrate this and talk about it and comment. So yeah,
And you
I think
touch
most
on
people's favorite chapter in a like it's sort of morbid because it's still fresh and it's hard to talk about, I think, for a lot of people. Um, but because we've all lived through it and it's that common experience, people connect to it.
the parallels, as James Cameron did in one of his interviews back then when it was happening, about the captain and his ego and the hubris, and even 111 years later it's almost the same story all over again. And it's so very interesting. Why do you think we're still diving? And there's an expedition out there right now as we speak, down there taking pictures. Why do you think humans still continue to want to visit Titanic?
Oh my gosh. Well, that's the million-dollar question. I think it's sort of like the siren call in the ocean that we just keep going back to Titanic. And I think we always will. And in a way, it's a good thing because it reminds us of mistakes that were made and how we've improved since then. So that's one side of it. The other side is it's fortunate because it helps drive innovation for deep sea exploration and innovations for subs and things like that. So my answer to why Titanic really, though, is maybe a bit different because I come from a psychology background and that's where I'm headed. I really like thinking about the people and understanding different people's responses to a moment of crisis, whether you're the captain or you're just an everyday second class, third class passenger, thrown into this where you think it's a normal voyage, and then suddenly your whole life is upended. So I think a lot of us like to sort of maybe pick out a passenger or two or somebody that we connect with within the Titanic story and think about how would we have reacted then, or how do we maybe wish we would have reacted. Maybe we would, maybe we won't. I like to think of Thomas Andrews in that sense of thinking, well, I sure hope if I was placed in a situation like that, I would have the character and the integrity and the courage to act as he did. But who knows? We never know how we're going to truly respond in a moment of crisis.
You mentioned Thomas Andrews. Do you have a favorite story or two from a crew member or a passenger?
Oh my goodness, that's hard. Well, Thomas Andrews is definitely my favorite character, as cliche as that is, because I think he's so many people's favorite, and for good reason. I mean,
Yeah, he's a great dude.
he was awesome, very sterling character. And funnily enough, actually, the book was going to be dedicated to him before I made it dedicated to my parents. So for a solid, like maybe 5 years, it was for Thomas Andrews, and I forget the rest of the dedication line, but fun fact. Um, Favorite story. Oh, there's so many. Sometimes certain lines will just strike me funny. I think the it's like a blooming picnic line. And if I might be mistaken, but I think they say that line in A Night to Remember. And I did make it a chapter title name. And I just thought that was so ludicrous and just, I don't know. Sometimes the lines that people say are just very, very, it brings you into the moment, I think.
How fortunate we are to have had the inquiries and to have Walter Lord, who put together A Night to Remember. I think most people in the Titanic book club community or Titanic community in general reveres A Night to Remember as one of their favorites anytime they're asked. And how could you not? It's just such a blessing that we have that moving forward. I think a big reason I wanted to start this podcast. There's no shortage of Titanic related podcasts out there, and I feel like it's just picking up steam. One of my favorite podcasters, a very good friend of mine now, LA Beatles, she has a
Oh,
podcast
yes.
called
I love her podcast.
Unsinkable, and she says that she'll say, I started this podcast because during COVID I turned to the podcast world for Titanic related stuff and I couldn't find hardly anything, and now you turn to the podcast platforms landscape and it's just filled. And so I'm thinking, why start another one when there's already so many out there? But I wanted to focus on, because I have my other podcast, Cove Pod, where I talk to creators, artists, musicians, actors, and I'm always fascinated by what inspires people. And when I looked across the Titanic enthusiast landscape, I just thought, there's so many people still telling the story. There's so many people putting work into this research and creating this. Tomorrow here on the YouTube channel, I'm talking to a sketch artist who makes amazing sketches of Titanic. And it's amazing to me how 112 years later, people seem to be more inspired than ever to continue to create and tell her story. And I think it's so great. Congratulations on publishing your book. Do you have another one in the works, or what's next?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably going to have to wait until after I start and finish my doctoral program, because I have a feeling they're going to keep me pretty busy during that. But I definitely want to write another book in the future. And I think it might be interesting to do one. So, to kind of summarize where I'm going with the PhD, I really want to do consulting for the three different industries: the offshore, aviation, and aerospace industries. So, and that has totally been informed by Titanic, 110%. So it might be interesting to talk about like what I learned and kind of experiences once I garner some real world fieldwork experience doing that, and put that into a book, and maybe another Titanic book in the works. You never know. We'll see what happens. Staying open minded with that.
But during this off year of yours before you start that doctorate program, you're traveling and hosting Titanic talks. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, definitely. So I offer four different talks of varying lengths. And the first one is my favorite one. It's called Leadership in Crisis, the Titanic, Carpathia, and Californian. So it was designed with naval battalions in mind, but is suitable for leadership-oriented groups of all kinds. And it takes the story of those three ships, but focuses in on the contrast in leadership between the Californian and the Carpathia, and examines basically the broader themes of leadership in crisis that we can pick out from those two ships, the way they handled um, or didn't handle things. And I intertwine psychology into that because that's my background, that's where I'm going. So specifically, I talk about the big five, the five-factor model of personality. They have heard of it. It actually, very fittingly, it falls under the acronym of OCEAN. So openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. So intertwining that and making it relevant to the audience, and thinking, where do I might fall, or where might I fall on those constructs? So that's that talk. And that is going to be given to a couple different battalions starting in the fall. And then I offer one that is related to our question of why Titanic. That's pretty much the whole, well, where I started with this presentation. It's called RMS Titanic, Lasting Legacy, Enduring Impact. And it really starts with that big picture question of why Titanic, why then, why now, and why in the future.
Hmm.
So talking about the parallels between Titanic and Ocean Gate, the indelible impact of Titanic on all of our maritime laws and practices. And then the third one is for school age groups. So almost the presentation that I wish I would have had in fourth grade. It's called Titanic 101, Life Legacy Loss. Gives you the basics of the Titanic story, all the Titanic trivia that 10-year-olds and the like sort of love of how many trains can fit into a smokestack, how many city blocks, that kind of interactive thing. And then tying in more social, cultural themes that I think are important to get kids thinking about early on, that are relevant to the Titanic story. And then the fourth one is just your basic signing and talking about introduction to Iron and Ice and myself. So excited to be working on that.
That's super interesting. When I was going to school, I mean, it's about to turn dark. I I was a young, naive kid, growing up here in Southern California, and I hadn't really been touched by death, and I wanted to be an actor. So in college, I was studying psychology and theater, drama, and I was flipping through the college catalog, and I found a course called Death and Dying, or Dying and Death, something like that. And I thought, well, that sounds dramatic. I want to take that. And it focused on the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and how, life begins, life ends. It's a natural process. She examined grieving. We had guest speakers come in who were had HIV and were just on death's door, talk to us. And it really opened my eyes. And I say to this day that it was the most valuable class I ever took, because it really informed the mantra that I now live my life by, which is, carpe diem, seize the day, make each day count, because we're going to die. And I was thinking just over the past few days about how, I've always thought this is a class that should be mandatory. I think if not in high school, that at least in college, first year or two of college. And how interesting would it be to kind of intertwine it with Titanic, since Titanic is such an interesting thing, and people are drawn to it. If there was a way to offer kids this kind of ease them into the subject of death and dying by examining Titanic and the passengers and those lives that were lost. I don't know. I'm just spitballing. I'm just throwing ideas out.
That's a really good idea. No, I like that. I think that should definitely be at least created, if not mandatory. There's so much to dissect about Titanic. And I think really that's why Titanic, we're still talking about it, because you never get tired of things to talk about. There's always a new angle, and people are interested in it for different reasons. The passengers, the engineering, the exploration side, the psychology. So yeah, you could definitely tailor a college talk or a college course on Titanic and take different elements of it. I would love to see somebody do that. If someone's out there, they want to give that a whack.
I'll just throw that out there for you. If you want to pick it up and run with it, go for it. But I think one of the most fascinating things about the Titanic story is, and we kind of touched on it earlier, the way people reacted and the mindset back then and how different it is today. One of the quotes Helen Benzer said on our talk, I think last week, was that the last chivalrous man, or the last man with class, went down with Titanic, something like that. I'm totally butchering it. But the whole women and children first thing, and how when faced with death, some passengers just accepted it and went, okay, well, now's my time. There's the iconic shot in James Cameron's movie of, was it Guggenheim, sitting with his glass of brandy, just watching the water come up. I know that the whole idea of men thinking as the ship goes down, not even trying to go for it, not even trying to survive, and just saying that this is my time. And would that still happen today? I think absolutely not. Of course, we have all the laws and everything and the safety measures in place for when ships go down. But if the Titanic was replicated today, would men act the same way? Probably not.
No. What was it? I think with the Costa Concordia that had that accident. I want to say it was 2010. Don't come for me in the comments. But yeah, I don't think it wasn't on the scale of Titanic, but even then, I mean, it was not anything similar to the reaction that Titanic's men had. So
Yeah.
I agree with you there.
Fascinating psychiatric stuff there.
Lots to dissect.
Yeah, have been so excited to talk to you and talk about your book. And I'm excited to actually, this is the first announcement anyone's heard of it, but we are putting together, as you know, a Titanic anniversary weekend for 2025 on the RMS Queen Mary in Long Beach. And hopefully it works out with your schedule and you can come out and give one of your talks and meet people and sell some books. And I'm just so glad we were able to have this conversation here today. Is there any last kind of ideas or messages that you might have for our listeners?
Well, probably most of the listeners are devout Titaniacs, but if you're not, and maybe you just clicked on this podcast because it was Titanic and maybe it sounded vaguely interesting, I would say give Titanic a whirl, give Titanic a chance, and just dive in and see what happens, because Titanic has a funny way of wrapping one tentacle around you and never letting go. So just, if it does, even if you don't think it's your thing, give it a try. You might be surprised.
Much like the gentleman in the gym who didn't think he'd be interested, and now he's a Titaniac.
He is. He talks to me about it every time now. Now that I see him, it's like a whole nother. What was the flooring in the Palm Court? So he's got it now.
Wow, that's so interesting. And I am so thankful for this Titanic community on social media and the way social media has just connected all of us, as it's a topic that I talk about in great length in other shows, but the accessibility and the new friends we make just by, hashtag Titanic, and seeing things about new books and new people who are, putting together creative works, and the accessibility I mentioned of being able to reach out and say hi and introduce yourself, and how open everybody is and how willing everybody is to continue to talk about Titanic. If you are out there and you love, how could you not be completely charmed by Kelly Skwarcan? Find her on Instagram at Kelly Skwarcan. That's KELLYSKWARCAN, as is in the title of this podcast. I'm sure you can find the spelling there. We'll put the links also in the show notes to her books and her book and her Instagram. And gosh, it's just been such a pleasure, Kelly. Thank you so much for taking the time with us.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Before we wish everybody happy Titanic trails, I'd like to ask all of our friends who enjoyed this conversation to subscribe to the Titanic Book Club newsletter and YouTube channel. Links are in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, leave a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. As an independent podcast just starting out, any great review helps us and helps people who are interested find shows like ours. If you love conversations with inspirational creators, you can find more on my personal podcast, Cove Pod. Click over, give that a listen. And I want to say thank you one more time to our guest, Kelly Skwarcan. And thank you all for tuning in. Until next time, seize the day, follow your heart's fire, and make each day count.